Where we left off last time, the kingdom of Israel was in trouble. It's having troubles with the neighboring countries. The kings are having trouble with their people and with the prophets. Ahab was followed by his son Jehoram on the throne. And one of the stories of Jehoram is he makes an alliance with Jehoshaphat, who's the king of Judah. So now you have Israel and Judah together, and they join with Edom in a battle against Moab. So are we starting to get the international politics of all this? Okay. So you know that north of the line is Israel, south of the line is Judah, and up here is Aram, and then here is Moab. Down here is Edom. And now it says that the king of Israel makes an alliance with the king of Judah to go together with the king of Edom against Moab. The king of Moab at this time is named Mesha. That's his name in the Bible, and in fact, one of the great archaeological discoveries was the Mesha description. It's a stela that's about as high as this lectern, and it's rounded on the top and then straight down. It is today in Paris in the Louvre. There's an exact cast of it in the Harvard Semitic Museum in Boston, Cambridge, and there's a cast of it in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And it was found by some Bedouin, and it's over 100 years ago. And they thought there was something bad about it, so they tried to destroy it. And they set it on, they put it on, I mean, it's stone, but they put it on a big fire and then threw ice on it, which cracked a lot. So about half of it is readable, but only kind of. And the other half is quite clearly readable. And it's one of only two things we have in Moabite, and Moabite is practically identical to Hebrew. When you look at it, the script looks just like Hebrew, and a lot of the words look just like Hebrew. And in it, he begins by saying, I am Mesha, I'm the king of the Moabites, and that darn king Omri across the Jordan from me, he attacked my country and he kept us in vassalage for many, many years. And then under his son, we rebelled against him and we became independent. And all this, it's pretty consistent with what's in the Bible. It's a really good one. And every now and then you hear that archaeological discoveries have been faked in the Near East, and they actually got the factory where a lot of these were being faked, and there was a trial and all, but there's no question about the Moabite inscription. I mean, the guys who found it weren't trying to sell it for money or fake it, or they tried to destroy the darn thing, and it's real. And in the story, it says that Israel and Judah and Edom are winning against Moab, and that the king of Moab, it said, tried to break through to the king of Edom, and he couldn't break through the lines to get to him. So it says he took his son, who would have reigned in his place, that is the crown prince, and he offered him as a sacrifice on the wall. And there was such an abhorrence of this, it says, that Israel and Judah and Edom, they all left off and went back, and that was the end of it. And you go, that doesn't make a lot of sense. First of all, I've told you, we don't have any record of human sacrifice in that time. That they didn't sacrifice their own children in any of the Near Eastern countries, with one possible exception we'll come to. And I'll give it away, Israel. But everywhere else, they didn't do that. And why would his sacrificing his son make the Edomites and the Jews and the Israelites all go away? And then you look at the text very carefully, and it says he was trying to break through to get to the king of Edom, and he couldn't do it. So he took his son, who would have reigned in his place. Whose son? Everybody assumes that King Mesha sacrificed his own son. It's that he broke through and he couldn't get the king of Edom, so he took the king of Edom's son that he captured, who would have reigned in his place. Right? It's pronouns. It's just the word he. You could take it either way. So how should we decide? Did he sacrifice his own son, or is it that he broke through and he got through to the king of Edom, and that's why everybody turned away? The Edomites didn't want to fight anymore. They had just had their crown prince executed by the enemy. And for this, you turn to one of the other books of the Bible. It's in the prophets. It's in the prophet Amos. It's right around the middle of the Bible, past the middle. And the prophet Amos, in the first 2 chapters, has this very interesting Hebrew poetry where it says, for 3 sins of such and such, and I'll pick a country, Philistines, for 3 sins of the Philistines, and for 4, I won't turn back their punishment. And then it lists some bad things that the Philistines did. And then it says for 3 sins and for 4 of Gaza, for 3 sins and for 4 of Tyre, and 3 sins and 4 of Edom. And it goes through all these different countries. And you got to picture this. It's very powerful of Amos. If you look at it, none of them ever add up to 3 or 4 or 7. It's just a poetic formula. For 3 sins, I wouldn't do it. For 4 sins, I wouldn't do it. And so it's like that. And he goes after Gaza, and you're going, yeah. And he's going after the Edomites, and you go, yeah. And you're going, Tyre, yeah. So he's going after all the other countries all around. But the interesting one is the one he does of Moab, and that is at the beginning of Amos chapter 2, when he's about halfway through all these countries that he's zapping for 3 and for 4. And it says, thus says Yahweh, for 3 sins of Moab, and for 4 I won't turn it back. And here's the first sin. Because he burned the bones of the king of Edom. Burned the bones of the king of Edom? When did he do that? It's referring to the thing in Kings. He burned the bones of the crown prince, it said, who would have ruled in his place. It's the future king of Edom. So what's going on in Amos, seemingly a reference that we've known nothing about, fits with this reference in Kings, and it's where you can start using one part of the Bible to shed light on another. Amos is a prophet who's alive at the time. But understand the international politics of that. And also, though, be very careful, because some people use that as an example whenever you say, but in the ancient Near East, those countries didn't practice sacrificing their children, and everybody goes, oh, no, here's an exception. King Mesha sacrificed his son. And you go, no, King Mesha didn't sacrifice his son. He burned up his son. That's different. So, at this point, there's a case where Aram comes down, and they surround Samaria, the capital of Israel. They do a siege. It gets so bad that the text, to convey how bad it is, says a piece of dove's dung would go for 5 pieces of silver. I don't know what you'd pay for a piece of dove's residue, but they must have been pretty hungry. And finally, it says that the king is walking along the wall of the city, and he sees 2 women, and they're arguing. And he says, what are you fighting about? And one of them says, well, there's nothing to eat. And yesterday we made a deal. She said that we'd eat my son, and that, today she'd give me her son, and we'd eat him. And so I did. And yesterday we ate my son, and now she's hiding her son and won't give him to me. And the king is just horrified at just how far this has gone. But we also remember that one of the curses at the Deuteronomy 28 list was mothers will eat their children. It's come true. So things get pretty horrible. But then Yahweh saves Israel by causing the Arameans to hear the sound of chariots coming, and they abandon their camp and run away. But there are no chariots coming. It was a trick. The next king after Jehoram is Jehu. Jehu is an officer who is encouraged by a prophet Elisha, so now he's got prophetic designation, and he takes the throne by killing Jehoram, the king of Israel. And not only does he kill him, he says, just for good measure, this was when Jehoram, the king of Israel, was allied with the king of Judah, Jehoshaphat, so he kills him too. So he kills the king of Israel, kills the king of Judah, and then he rides back to Samaria, and the queen mother, Jezebel, comes out, and he has her killed too. It says they throw her down from the wall. She's killed down at the bottom. Wild dogs come. Remember, dogs are not domesticated yet in this period. And it says nothing is left of her but the bones of her hands and feet. They eat all the good parts. That's a nasty way to go. Jehu, we know also from the ancient Near East, there is an Assyrian emperor who's mentioned. His name is Shalmaneser. I think you'll see that's spelled with a Z or with an S. And remember, Assyria is over here by the Tigris River. This is the Euphrates. They empty into the Persian Gulf. And the Assyrians are there, and they're starting to become a big power. And what's going to change now, the whole history of everything we've been looking at, is it's all been local lately. But now, big powers develop. First the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then ultimately the Persians. Big powers develop from the east, and all they think about for about 80% of their day is conquering Egypt. And you know it's on the way. And so Shalmaneser erected the black obelisk. You can go see it. It's in the British Museum. It's a little taller than I am, and it's written on 4 sides, and it's got art on it, and actually shows a picture of a king identified as King Jehu bowing in front of the Emperor Shalmaneser. That's the good news historically. The bad news is it says Jehu, son of Omri, which he wasn't. They put him in the line of Omri and Ahab. He's the guy who killed the family of Omri and Ahab and threw them out and established his own dynasty. And I suspect the king of the Syrians, like he knew local politics. I don't think he cared. So either he got it wrong or the Bible's got it wrong. I think the smart money's on the Bible. I mean, you can't find a copy of the Black Obelisk in hotel drawers, but the Bible's there, so it's a lasting power. I realize that was a very poor argument as historical arguments go, but it's interesting anyway. So Jehu kills the whole family of Omri and Ahab, that dynasty. And then his son Jehoahaz, I'm going to zip through like the last 10 kings of Israel. Jehoahaz is his son during that period. Aram becomes even stronger and continues to attack Israel. So here was something that under David was governed by Israel. Now they're making Israel in trouble, so they're developing as a country. Jehoahaz has a son named Joash. Joash defeats Aram in 3 battles, which was the dying prophecy of Elijah. But then Moabite bands start to attack Israel. So also, again, these countries that had been ruled by Israel or Judah are now becoming stronger themselves. He actually defeats Judah, this Jehoahaz. He defeats Judah and raids the temple. You understand what we've reached now? Where Israel is fighting a war against Judah and entering the precincts of the temple. So it's all unraveling now. That great empire that you had under David and Solomon is now little guys all fighting against each other when what they should be spending their days worrying about is over here, is the Assyrians, what is today Iraq. Joash is succeeded by his son, Jeroboam II. He defeats Aram. He's succeeded by his son, Zechariah, which has nothing to do with the prophet Zechariah. Zechariah rules for just 6 months. and then a general named Shallum kills him, but Shallum doesn't have prophetic designation, so he's not a kosher, you might say, king. His reign, it says, lasts 1 month. And then his general Menachem kills him, and then the Assyrians arrive and start exacting tribute from Israel during that reign. And then Pekahiah, the son of Menachem, comes to the throne. He rules 2 years. Then Pekach kills Pekahiah. During that period, the great Assyrian Empire, Emperor Tiglath-Pileser comes along. They did have cool names. I think I've mentioned it's common among Assyriologists and biblical scholars to name their cats for Assyrian emperors. What's your cat saying? Tiglath-Pileser III. They do that. There's some of you who'd hear that and say, get a life. But I mean, it's as good as naming your cat Madonna. I don't know. Whatever. Actually, that'd be kind of a good name for a cat. Oh, anyway. Then another man comes to the throne, Hoshea, who kills Pekach. He has to pay tribute to the Assyrians. So it says what this Hoshea, this king of Israel, the last king of Israel, hint, hint, he allies with Egypt and stops paying tribute to Assyria. Now, this is a phenomenon you keep seeing in the ancient Near East. Some power from the east, whether it's Aram or Assyria or Babylonia or Persia, when they start moving west, when they get this close, Egypt will always make a treaty with Israel to try to get Israel on their side so that Israel becomes a buffer against the east. Because remember, all they ever want is the gold of Egypt. So in this period, he stops paying tribute to the Assyrians and allies with Egypt instead. Now remember, I told you that in their system, if you are a vassal to another king, you get your choice. Pick one or the other as your suzerain, but you can't have both. So he stops tribute to Assyria and starts paying to Egypt. Now, this is one of those cases where it's like only biblical scholars who apparently who get the current Near East. In the 1980s, when remember there was do you remember? There was there was a treaty made between Israel and Egypt. Menachem Begin was the prime minister of Israel, and Anwar Sadat, who looked like a certain character in the movie I Love You, Man, he was the prime minister of Egypt, and they made a treaty. It was a famous thing where Sadat made a speech in the Egyptian parliament saying, I would even go to Jerusalem for peace. And Menachem Begin said, okay, you're invited. And he did. He went to Jerusalem and made a speech in the parliament of Israel, and Begin went to Egypt, and it ended up eventually on the White House lawn, the two countries, Israel and Egypt, making a peace, which at times has been shaky but lasts to the present day. And what was going on at the time, because everybody said, why now? Why did Egypt make peace with Israel now, after they'd been, through 2 wars against each other in 67 and 73, well, and 48 also, so 3 wars against each other, and that's not counting the Sinai campaign in 56. So you're talking not a happy relationship, and now suddenly I would go to Jerusalem for peace, and okay, come, let's make peace. So people had a million different theories about what happened. Here's the theory as Bible scholars see it. What was going on at the time is there was a war up here in Lebanon, what had been Phoenicia in our biblical times. Lebanon was having, are you interested in this? This is contemporary politics. Lebanon was having a civil war between the powerful government of Lebanon, which was Catholic Lebanese, and against, on the other side, were Muslim Lebanese, and the PLO. And the question was, what was Aram going to do? And the president of Aram, which was now called Syria in our lifetimes, was President Assad, who was the father of the current President Assad. And so what was he going to do? Was he going to go in and fight? What side? What was he going to do in all of this? And who should arrive in Damascus to discuss this with him? Heinz Kissinger, the Secretary of State of the United States, Henry Kissinger. I would imitate the way he talks, but somehow whenever I try to do Henry Kissinger, it comes out as Arnold Schwarzenegger. So to me, all Austrian and German accents are similar. That's not racist, it's ethnicist or linguicist or something. It's bad, whatever it is, it's bad. And Kissinger says to Assad, you have three choices. Choice number one is you come in on the side of the PLO and the Muslim Arabs against the Christian Arabs. He says, in which case Israel will get into it too, because they'll have to, and they'll defeat you. Choice two is you sit it out, don't take either side, in which case you look weak and give up any chance at showing any influence in this region and endanger your own future. So choice three is you come in on the side of the Christians. And Assad is a Muslim. And he said, why would I come in on the side of the Christian Lebanese against the Muslim Lebanese and PLO? To which Kissinger answered two words, Greater Syria. Greater Syria is a doctrine among the Syrians, like America had the doctrine of manifest destiny, that it was understood, early America, that everything eventually, as far as the Pacific Ocean, was going to become the United States, which has happened. Sadly, it includes a couple of states that we could probably do it. Anyway, I like all 50. Some of my best friends come from all 50. And so the Syrian doctrine is that everything from here over belongs to Syria. And so it would come over here. Assad did that. He came in on the side of the governing Lebanese, who are Christian, and he took about a third or 40% of the eastern part of Lebanon. He just took it and sat there until, I don't remember how many years ago, but it was a fair number of years that Syria just took a chunk of Lebanon, and the whole world kind of went along with it and looked the other way. So as Syria is moving west, that week, Anwar Sadat, the prime minister of Egypt, flew to Romania. Why Romania? Because in those days there was this thing they used to have called the Soviet Union. It's not on the maps anymore. The Soviet Union had nothing to do with Israel except one country that had open communications diplomatically with Israel, Romania. And then he flies back from Romania to Egypt, possibly making a stop in Saudi Arabia on the way, because they were giving him all the money that kept his country alive. And he made his famous speech. Presumably the trip to Romania was to negotiate the peace with Israel. Now, the timing of that looks to us in the business just like what you just studied biblically. Somebody over here starts moving west. Egypt doesn't like how that feels, so they make peace with the country that's in between and is a buffer. No contemporary book describing what happened in the 1980s will mention this at all. When King Hoshea stops and allies with Egypt, he picked the wrong horse in that horse race. And the Assyrians came over and they kicked the heck out of Israel and basically wiped it off the map. And what the Assyrians would do is when they would defeat other countries, they would play musical chairs with these countries. They'd pick up the people they conquered here and put them there, and pick up the people they conquered here and put them there, and they'd move them around so nobody would be located fighting for his own land anymore. and thus they create an empire instead of merely a series of countries. So they take Israel off the map. The year is 722. I don't have you learn and memorize a lot of dates, but you can remember at least that Israel and Judah separated and became the two countries after the death of Solomon in 922, and they ceased to exist in 722, so it's easy because it's an exactly 200-year run. They exile the population, is the account according to the Bible. That's in 2 Kings 17, and you should read it. And it says there that the reason it happened was for religious reasons, that the kingdom of Israel had been bad, that they'd violated covenant, that they worshipped other gods, and above all, that they kept, remembered, the golden calves at Dan and Bethel as alternate places of worship. That is to say, on the one hand, we can all look at this with a very cold eye, politically, economically, and see perfectly understandable reasons why this happens to Israel in terms of their alliances with Egypt and Aram and Assyria and so on. And on the other hand, we should understand that our biblical author is a person who's interpreting history through a prism of religion. And so he understands this to be happening because of what their behavior had been religiously. So there's nothing left of Israel, and it's called, to this day, they speak of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Nobody knows what happens to them. I've heard every theory in the world. The Ethiopian Jews, who now mostly live in Israel, because life was not very good for them in Ethiopia, claim descent from the 10 lost tribes. I've heard the Native Americans. I've heard the Eskimos. I've heard the Italians. Well, there's good evidence on the Italians because they like Italian food, just like Jews. So was that ethnicist, religiousist, or just dumb? Anyway, I do know where the 10 lost tribes of Israel are, and I'm going to tell you, and then you'll know too. When there's a war, and one side really utterly defeats the other side in world history, what happens to the population of the defeated side most of the time? The majority of the people do not get killed, they do not get enslaved, and they don't get exiled. You don't move an entire country's population in an exile. The majority of the population are refugees, which we in the United States, of all places, that's called a land of refugees, where almost everybody in America is descended from refugees, except Native Americans and African Americans. And Native Americans came long before. Well, they may have been refugees from whatever was going on in Asia, but it's so long ago we just don't know. And African Americans were brought here against their will. But most Americans are descended from people who got out of Europe or wherever, various parts of the world, Asia, in order to come here and make a life here. And if you were an Israelite and the Assyrian army, the most powerful army in the world, is on its way, where would you go to get away? How about Judah, right? Which is just across the line. The whole region we're talking about is smaller than Georgia. And you go a few miles south where there's probably, some guy who's married to your cousin, and they have a religion very similar to your religion. They have a language that's almost identical to your language. They have all kinds of common traditions, common styles of pottery, that's where you go. And indeed, when we excavated in the city of David, the excavations of biblical Jerusalem, we found that the population did increase in this period as more and more people moved down the hill. Because if you look, the oldest parts of Jerusalem, everybody lives at the top of the mountain where it's the safest. And now there's new population come in, so you start seeing houses farther down. So where are the 10 lost tribes of Israel? Why can nobody find them? Because they're the Jews. They came in and they mixed in with the Judean population, and now if you're a Jew, nobody says, oh, you're a Jew. Did you come from Issachar or Reuben or Simeon? Nobody knows that anymore. They're all mixed in. And that's why you can't find them, because they're under your noses. It's like, there was that joke that used to be told in the Soviet Union days. This guy is coming out of the Russian factory, and the factory worker every day comes out, and the KGB, the secret police, they know that the secret police that everybody in the world knew about, they know that he's stealing something, but they can't figure out what it is. They go through his wheelbarrow over and over and take it apart, and they can't figure out what it is he's stealing, and he's stealing wheelbarrows. That's where the 10 lost tribes are. They're the wheelbarrow. Nobody can find them because they're the Jews. So we look at Eskimos. I mean, leave the Eskimos alone. Some of my best friends. All right, so now we've gone through this whole kingdom of Israel for 200 years. Now we have to back up 200 years. Remember when Jeroboam the first started the kingdom of Israel, that's when Rehoboam was the king of Judah. His son is Abijam, Hebrew Aviyam. And you don't have to memorize, again, what all of these kings of Judah did, but you should note a couple of notations on them. That, again, our historian is telling the story of the kings in terms of how obedient they are to the covenant. And on Abijam, it says, this is 1 Kings 15, and he went in all the sins of his father before him, that's Rehoboam, and his heart was not whole with Yahweh his God, like the heart of David his father. Each one is considered like a son of David, even if they're a grandson or a great-grandson or whatever, if they're in the line of the dynasty of David. So it says he wasn't a good king who was good with God the way David was, but for the sake of David, Yahweh his God gave him a holding in Jerusalem to establish his son after him and to establish Jerusalem. That is, it's the Davidic covenant. It's saying one of David's descendants didn't keep the rules of the covenant, but still God will not take away Jerusalem and Judah from him. Judah loses control over Israel, but their kings remain in power in Jerusalem and over their own country. After Abijam is King Asa, he's good. He removes any idols that were at the temple. He removes the queen mother. He removes, it says there are male prostitutes there at the temple. He removes them. His son is Jehoshaphat. He's a good king, it says, except he retains the high places. Remember I told you high places, Bamot, these platforms where you could worship outside of Jerusalem. So every king you'll see is being rated as good or bad in the eyes of Yahweh. Most of them are bad. But Jehoshaphat, it says he was good, except he really should have gotten rid of those Bamot. He's the one who makes peace with Israel, and together they attacked with the king of Edom and Mesha. Can you keep track of this now? There's like these two histories running in parallel. His son is Jehoram, and they do a political marriage. Jehoram, the prince of Judah, is married to the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, the king and queen of Israel at the time. And like mother, like daughter, Jezebel's daughter is named Atalia, which you'll see in various English, Latin alphabet pronunciations, spellings. Atalia's a bitch. Jehoram, it says about him, and he went in the path of the kings of Israel. Like that, the worst thing you can say about a king of Judah is, oh yeah, he was like those kings in Israel. He did wrong in the eyes of Yahweh, but Yahweh was not willing to destroy Judah for the sake of David, his servant, as he had said to him, to give him and his sons a holding always. That's in 2 Kings 8, and it's that same formula like you saw with King Abijam. Yeah, he wasn't good. Yeah, he was actually quite bad, but God made a covenant with David. God keeps his covenants. Now his son is King Ahaziah, and King Ahaziah goes to visit King Joram, the king of Israel, and he picked a bad day for the visit. It was the day of the Jehu rebellion. And Jehu not only, remember, killed the king of Israel, but he killed the king of Judah as well. So now Atalia's back in Jerusalem. And she notices that her son has just been killed along with the king of Israel. So she does what any loving mother and Queen Mum would do. She kills all the other children of all the other wives of the king. She wipes out all the heirs to the throne of Judah and makes herself queen. This is the only time, a ruling queen. This is the only time you have a woman ruling in the story. The interesting thing about this, so Athaliah becomes like the ultimate, the usurper, the strongest, toughest woman in the Bible. And there's a wonderful Bible scholar in Jerusalem, and her name is Athaliah Brenner. Now, I have no idea why her parents named her Athaliah, but she is like a leading feminist Bible scholar of the world, because, this happens. When I was at UCSD, we had a guy whose name was Darwin, was his first name. He was a biologist. And we had a guy named Zeno, he was a philosopher. And so if any of you think about this when you name your children, because there may be such a thing as name determinism. So she gets them all, it says, except for one baby named Joash. And the priests take the baby, the one surviving prince, and they hide him in the temple for 6 years. And then when he's only a little boy, the high priest and the military take over. They establish Joash as the king, and they kill Athaliah. So like mother, like daughter, she ends up dead also. They destroy a temple of Baal that she had put up. And then Joash is considered a good king. After all, he's raised by the high priest, who's clearly from the story you tell you, he's the regent running the country until the kid comes of age to be king. And he too, it says he was good, except he retained these Bamot. But then he was assassinated, and the next king was Amaziah. And he too, it says he's good, but he keeps the Bamot. And then he's assassinated. And he's followed by King Azariah. He's good, but he retains the Bamot. So you see, our historian, what he wants is the law of centralization, the first law you get in the Deuteronomic Law Code. And you're only supposed to worship at this one place, the place where God causes his name to dwell. And that ain't no Bamot, that's the temple. And then he is succeeded by King Ahaz, and Ahaz, again, is compared to the kings of Israel, which again means from the point of view of our historian, he was a really bad king. And it's more than just retaining Bamot, he's just bad. He becomes a vassal to Assyria. He's the king in Judah when Tiglath-Pileser shows up. So now Assyria is getting very powerful. They defeat Aram, and Israel, during his reign, is going to fall and get wiped off the map. And then there's going to be only Judah left. And now we come to a king on whom you do want to focus and whose name you do want to know in Judah, and that is King Hezekiah. So you may not have to memorize all these names of all these kings, but at least you have to know Saul, David, and Solomon, the first three, right? You have to know Rehoboam and Jeroboam because they're each the founding king of these two countries, and their names are similar, so what the heck, we may as well learn them. And then in northern Israel, you especially want to know the dynasty of Omri, and in particular Ahab and Jezebel, because they're famous. And they're opposite the prophets Elijah and Elisha, so that adds to their fame as well. But you don't need to memorize the names and dates of all the others. Now in Judah, one you absolutely have to know is King Hezekiah. Our historian gives him a nearly perfect rating. He removes the high places. He removes any images, idols that have been worshipped in Judah. There's an Asherah, which is either a statue of a goddess, or they would use a sacred pole or a sacred tree as the symbol of this goddess. And there's one other thing he destroys, the Nehushtan. What the heck is Nehushtan? Remember back in the book of Numbers, we were running through all of these rebellion stories of everybody who rebelled against Moses and how each one was handled. And there was one, you'll remember, where these snakes are biting, poisonous snakes are sent, as it were, by God against the Israelites. And so Moses makes a bronze snake and puts it on a pole. And if you're bitten by a snake and you look up at the snake on the pole, you are miraculously cured. That is the only fairly clear example of sympathetic magic in the Bible. And I said it when we were learning about that. Now, don't forget that snake. That's going to matter later. And you know Moses is associated with snake. At the burning bush, there's the snake. The day I passed around the National Geographic that had the pictures of the maybe Red Sea splitting and the picture of the face of Ramses II, there was also in there a picture of a bronze snake that was found in the region that is Midian, just where you'd kind of expect it to be. And so there's the snake connection with Moses. Now it says that in this period of Hezekiah, people had started burning incense in front of the statue of the bronze serpent. That's bad. So they are starting to treat it like an idol. When it wasn't supposed to be an idol, it was supposed to be this thing that Moses once invented in a certain situation. Hezekiah doesn't like that, so he has it destroyed. They break up the Nehushtan. And you go, wait a minute. Something that's associated with Moses himself? Made by the hand of Moses? A king of Israel would destroy that? And you go, well, people were burning incense. And you go, so put it in a closet someplace. Bury it. But he destroys it. Why did he do that? Lecture 21. But take note of it. It's a big deal. During this period of Ahaz and Hezekiah, Assyria comes and becomes so powerful, they destroy Israel. And now it's up to Hezekiah. What is he going to do, he and Judah, against the Assyrians? Israel's gone. There's nobody, including Egypt, strong enough to defend them against Assyria. And little Judah is not big enough or strong enough to handle Assyria. But Hezekiah does rebel against Assyria. He does ally with Egypt, which never once works, biblically. And so the great Sennacherib comes along. And among names of Assyrian emperors, this is one you actually have to know. Sennacherib comes with his armies, and he's wiping out everybody. And he recorded it. It's in an inscription. It's called the Sennacherib Prism inscription, not prison. Prism because it's about this tall, and it's in hardened clay, and it has 6 sides. What's that? Hexagonal. And an inscription in Akkadian on each side describing each of his campaigns and who he conquered and what he did. And in one of them, it says that he came to Judah and laid siege to Jerusalem. And this is my translation of that portion of the Prism inscription of Hezekiah. You can go and see it. It's in the British Museum. It's behind glass, but very clear. You can see it there. You can just look up pictures of it, but you can actually just go and see the thing. And it's in a room in the British Museum where all around the walls, the English cut the walls off of the palace of Sennacherib, which was excavated in what is now Iraq. And the British basically stole it and put it in the British Museum. And it's always been a big question about these things, the Elgin marbles from the Parthenon and from the Acropolis, rather, in Athens, the other Athens, not our Athens. They're in the British Museum, and the Greeks have always wanted those back from the British. And on the one hand, going to museums is really cool, and on the other hand, you go, this shouldn't be here. This should be back there. And on the other hand, because there have been a couple of terrible wars in Iraq, and the museum in Iraq was raided, and a lot of those treasures are gone. And, they probably come up on the black market every now and then, but I mean, terrible things happened. Things were destroyed. So ironically, if the British hadn't stolen this, we probably wouldn't have it. But you can see it where he was so proud of what he had done in Judah that he did these like frescoes carved into the walls all around this giant room of his palace, which is now a giant room of the British Museum, showing the defeat of King Hezekiah and the Jews in Judah. And here's what he wrote about it on his prism stela. He said, and Hezekiah the Judean, okay, so there's no question, it's Akkadian Iazakiyahu Iudaya, which is Hezekiah the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke. I besieged and captured 46 of his strong-walled cities, and the small cities of their environs, which were without number, by the spanning of a ramp, the approach of siege machines, the battling of infantry, breaches, breaks, and storm ladders. 200,150 people, small and great, male and female, horses, asses, mules, camels, oxen, and sheep and goats without number, I brought out from them, and I counted as spoil. Himself, Hezekiah, I locked him up like a caged bird in the midst of Jerusalem, his royal city. I connected siege works against him so that I turned those going out of his city gate into a taboo for him. I cut off the cities that I despoiled from the midst of his land, and I gave them to Metinti, king of Ashdod, Padi, king of Ekron, and Silibal, king of Gaza. I always liked that name, Silibal. But you notice those cities, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza, those are Philistine cities. So he's taking territory away from Judah and giving it to the Philistines. To the former tribute I added and fixed against him the giving of their annual tribute, greeting gifts of my lordship. The fear of the splendor of my majesty overcame Hezekiah, he said modestly. And the Arabs and crack troops that he had brought in, the word Arab there is uncertain, I should tell you, because there isn't Arabic yet in that period, so that's controversial. And crack troops that he had brought in for the strengthening of Jerusalem, his royal city, ceased working. He sent a heavy tribute, and his daughters and his harem and singers, together with 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver, choice antimony, blocks of stone, ivory couches, ivory armchairs, elephant hides, ivory, ebony, boxwood, and all sorts of things to the midst of Nineveh, my lordly city. And he sent his ambassadors for the giving of tribute and the performance of vassal service. That sounds like a pretty big defeat. Now, most of that is consistent with what we have in the Bible, where it says there that Sennacherib had defeated all the cities of Judah except for Jerusalem, which is what he says too. You notice he never captures Jerusalem. And that's what you want to note. He says, I kept Hezekiah like a caged bird inside Jerusalem, his royal city. The function of a siege is not to keep the other guy trapped in the city. The function of a siege is to win. It is to get in, if possible, and get them. And what he did here is what we call, spin in present political terms. You put the best face you can on the whole thing. He defeated everything, but he never succeeded in capturing Jerusalem. And in Chronicles, the other book that we're not reading in this course, it describes that that's when Hezekiah built this tunnel down below Jerusalem, and that connected with the Canaanite water shaft that we had dug in the city of David, so that they were able to bring water up, and they survived the siege. And as I've told you, you can go and walk through the Hezekiah tunnel, and in that tunnel there was an inscription found, and it's in 8th century Hebrew script, just like it should be. And that was taken by the Turks when they ruled the area. So if you want to see the Hezekiah tunnel inscription, you have to go to the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul to see it. So you can do this tour. You go to the Louvre and the British Museum and the Istanbul Museum and get to see all the stuff that was taken from the Near East. And it's fascinating to read. In it, they describe how they dug the tunnel. And it's that they were in such a hurry because the Assyrians are coming that they did this very risky thing, which is they started digging from two ends to meet in the middle. And they didn't have the technology to do that then, but they said, what the heck, let's go for it. And it describes how they were digging the two and they were missing each other. So they heard the sound of each other's hammers and chisels and everything breaking the tunnel through, and they dug toward the sound and they met each other. And I'm told if you walk through there, you can see the jag point where that happened, but the dog leg of the tunnel. But since I'm claustrophobic, I've never seen and never will. Maybe if I took a bunch of Xanax or something, I could go see that. But I'm sorry, I can't, I'm prescribed. I mean, Yeah, Jacob.
The site I excavate at every summer, Delmarna, is one of the cities we think, what's his name?
Sennacherib?
Sennacherib fought against, or laid siege against, Libna.
No.
And found like the 8th century destruction layer. So.
It's just what we should find.
Lachish, when you see a giant siege ramp built up the side.
Yeah, I want to tell everybody the story of Lachish, which is the second biggest city in Judah after Jerusalem is Lachish. Lachish, it has a tell there. It's called Tel Lachish. And a tell, I've told you, it looks like a big mesa. It's flat, and it's where several cities through time have been built on top of each other. And there is a destruction layer. It's just what he just said, at just the right time. And the siege of Lachish was done just like hundreds of years later, the famous siege of Masada by the Romans. There's a new movie coming out about that. I was an advisor on the book for that. And what they did at Lachish is, right, here's the mesa, so the Jews are up here, the Assyrians are down here, so it's really hard to get up there. So they built a ramp of stones and dirt all the way up and then came up with siege machines and captured the city. And the reason we know that is you can see pictures of it in the wall of the British Museum where it describes, there you are. It's Sennacherib's own picture of what happened, and you see the siege ramp where they built it up and then they put wooden planks over it, and they have these siege machines which are like the equivalent of tanks in that period. They're like giant chariots with a giant spear coming out the front. And you see that the Jews up on top are shooting arrows and spears that have they're like torches that they're throwing down because they're trying to burn up the siege machine and the ramp. And you see the Assyrians with these giant scoops of water. So they're throwing fire down and they're putting water on to put the fire out. And you're actually you're seeing the description of the battle. So picture what you've got here. This is a very rare thing for the Bible. You're getting the Jewish point of view from inside the city walls, and you're getting the Assyrian point of view from outside the city walls, and you're getting both sides' version of what happened. And in some ways, they differ. But notably, where he says, I kept him like a caged bird, that sounds like what the Bible story is. Yeah, they didn't get in. And he says they paid, 30 talents of gold and 800 of silver. In the Bible, it says 30 talents of gold and 300 of silver. So, okay, they have a more minimized number. And also, you can imagine a scribe making that mistake, 30 and 300 instead of 30 and 800. But whether it's a mistake or intentional, they both have the 30 talents of gold and the hundreds of talents of silver, and the destruction of all these cities. It's a very rare piece of confirmation. Now, there's one little part that's different between the two. Sennacherib says, yeah, I took all this tribute and harem women and singers, and I went home. And the Judean version is, that night an angel of the Lord went out in the camp of the Assyrians and killed them. And here comes one of my favorite verses of the Bible. And they woke up the next morning, and here they were all dead corpses. How many things are wrong with that verse? And it's the dead corpses as opposed to the other corpses that I'm especially interested in there. And how they woke up. But apparently it's saying, a lot of them were killed. And there have been theories over history what that means. An angel went through their camp, that it was actually a disease struck the Assyrian camp, and so they left off because of that. What appears to have happened, though, is the Assyrians are laying siege to the Jews. The Assyrians can't get in. The Jews can't get out. They reach, as it were, a compromise where the Jews pay a heavy tribute to the Assyrians and the Assyrians go away. But the important bottom line of all of this is the Assyrians are a big power now. Israel didn't survive. Judah did. And the only part of Judah that survived is Jerusalem. And again, the growth of the population of Jerusalem in this period indicates that what Hezekiah's strategy was not to attempt to defend the whole country against the Assyrians, which would mean putting an army out in the field against the Assyrians. His strategy was bring everybody to Jerusalem, keep the army in Jerusalem, fight off the Assyrians, and at least save Jerusalem, because if one city survives, we still exist. And that's what he did. This had tremendous implications for the whole destiny, obviously, of Judaism and the Jews, and even the nature of Judaism. There's evidence now we have that in biblical times people believed in not just life after death, but ancestor veneration. You would go to the grave of grandma and you would pray to grandma to look over the family. You would bring food and you'd bring water to the grave. And all the graves of your ancestors you can find. And we've excavated tombs, and they bury in groups of 4 generations at a time. That's really interesting because remember, even in the 10 Commandments, God visits the sins of the parents to the 4th generation. And after 4th generation, you close the tomb and you start a new one for the next 4 generations. And in order to do ancestor veneration, you have to have access to the graves of your ancestors. That's where you do it. When the Assyrians wiped out the whole countryside except Judah, that is when it really became possible to enforce the law of centralization. We can argue about how old the law was and when it was written, but we know when it started really kicking in and people had to obey it. When there was no more tomb of grandma, then your only place of worship was the temple. And there's no more turning to your ancestors. Now you can only turn to the priests. It was a big difference. That will come back in later discussions in the course. But it's an impact on the whole history of Judaism, the attitude of Judaism toward life after death. So the mention of that angel who strikes the camp of the Assyrians, that's the last angel now. Remember I told you that we're watching evidence of these various signs of divine presence. And the last angel that was seen anybody was by Elijah. Here's an angel where it never says anybody sees it. So it's one step further removed, and now after this one, you won't even get angels in the story anymore. But remember, there's still a few hundred years of the story to go. So you're still watching all these signs of the divine presence disappear. Then the story of Hezekiah ends with a scene that takes place between him and the prophet Isaiah. And this is the same Isaiah who's in the book of Isaiah, who's a prophet, an 8th century prophet. He's a major person at this time. And Hezekiah says he gets ill. And he asks Isaiah, am I going to live or am I going to die? And Isaiah says, make out your will, straighten out your affairs. You're going to die. And Isaiah goes out, and God says to Isaiah, no, wait a minute. Hezekiah just turned to the wall and started praying for forgiveness and extra time. So go back, give him an extra 10 years. So Isaiah goes back and he says, wait, hold that. You're not going to die for 10 years. And Hezekiah gets an extra 10 years. And Hezekiah says to Isaiah, how will I know this? And Isaiah says, okay, we'll give you a sign from God. You want that shadow on the steps. In a lot of your English translation says the shadow on a, a sundial. That's not correct. It refers to its steps. Probably the stairs of the temple, could be the steps of the palace. He says, you want the shadow to go forward or backward? And he says, well, as the sun goes this way, the shadow always goes that way. Make it go that way. And he does. It happens. And you don't know how many people see that, but that's the last of even these personal miracles we've been seeing in the Bible. We saw the public miracles ended with Elijah at Mount Carmel, when the fire comes down on the altar and all that. But now you're not even going to see these individual miracles, the kind like Elijah and Elisha did. And one of the things about the prophets is there are almost no miracles in the books of the prophets. That's not what they do. Moses, yes. Elijah and Elisha, yes. But when you read about the 15 prophets who have books named for them, there are very few miracles that take place. The famous one is in the book of Jonah, but that's a special case in itself. And if it's a miracle, and if anybody sees it, the fish thing that happens. And there is one in the book of Isaiah, and it's about this shadow going backwards, but it's word for word the same as in the book of Kings. So it looks like whoever assembled the book of Isaiah took the story out of Kings and put it also in the book of Isaiah because it related to Isaiah's life. So the prophetic books themselves, these prophets, they don't prove who they are by doing miracles. Hezekiah, it says, meets with some Babylonian ambassadors. Now remember, Assyria is still the big power over here. Babylon is more over here toward the Euphrates. And it's just developing. But Assyria is still the main power. But Hezekiah, it says, shows the treasures of the temple and the palace to the Babylonian ambassadors. And Isaiah comes to him again, and Isaiah says, who are these people? What were they doing? He says, oh, it's nothing. They're people from far away. And Isaiah says, therefore, the treasures that you've shown them will be carried off to Babylon, and your sons, who will be born out of your loins, he said, your literal sons, not your great-grandsons or anything, will be carried off and imprisoned in Babylon. And that happens. Isaiah's son, Manasseh, it's not mentioned here in the book of Kings, but in the book of Chronicles, it says he was, in fact, carried off to prison in Babylon. And it sounds like a prediction of a Babylonian exile, which is coming, but, and that's how almost all Bible scholars take it. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's referring to the capture of Manasseh and imprisonment of him and the various things. But people get confused because the prediction takes place in the book of Kings and the fulfillment takes place in the book of Chronicles, and that's apparently too hard for most of us, to have to read two books. Hezekiah is succeeded by his son Manasseh. Manasseh is rotten, rotten, rotten. He had a long reign and fairly successful, but from the point of view of a biblical historian, he's bad because he rebuilds the high places that his father Hezekiah had gotten rid of. So here's Hezekiah, who's just gotten the best rating of any king so far. He's better than David, he's better than Solomon, he's better than all of them, because not only did he do a lot of good stuff and survive the Assyrians, but he got rid of the high places. He did the one thing that every other king has failed to do. He's made Jerusalem the central place. It says he just leaves a few altars to other gods that were still left in the court of the temple. They'd been built by King Solomon because of Solomon's wives and all, and they've been sitting there this whole time. And it says he left them there, but okay. It says there was no king like him before him or after him. There's Baal worship, he gets rid of that. There's high places, he gets rid of them. There's Asherah, worship of some goddess, he gets rid of that. Other gods too, he gets rid of those. And it says Manasseh sacrifices his own son. So now you have a king of the Jews doing child sacrifice. So when I tell you there's no evidence of anybody in the ancient Near East doing human sacrifice, except the Phoenicians up here did it at their colony at Carthage, which is over here on the north coast of Africa, but never in the Near East. There's no child sacrifice known, not archaeologically from remains and not from texts referring to it, except in Israel and Judah themselves, where there are accounts of human sacrifice. Now, we don't have any physical evidence of it archaeologically, so there's nothing. But we do have a report in the Bible that King Manasseh sacrificed his own son, and that he put up an Asherah, which is either a statue of the goddess or one of these poles or trees symbolizing the goddess, back at the temple. Politically speaking, that means he resumed being a vassal to Assyria again. So he's putting in Assyrian gods, perhaps. And so it gives no names in the text, but some unnamed prophets predict that that Judah is now going to get destroyed. It's going to go the way of Israel. That he has now gotten so bad. It's such a violation of the Davidic covenant that even the Davidic covenant is not going to save Judah. And Manasseh was succeeded by his son Ammon. Ammon was assassinated when he was still a young man, and so his son came to the throne when he was only 8 years old. And as you know, it's these little kid kings who do the best job. And Josiah is the other name that you really must remember. So it's Hezekiah and then Josiah. Since he comes to the throne at 8 years old, presumably he, like Joash, the other one who came to the throne very young, must have a regent, and it is apparently the high priest. The priest at the temple at this time is a priest named Hilkiah. Remember him, his name will come up again in the course. And the king sends a scribe named Shaphan. And Shaphan is sent by the king to check with Hilkiah back at the temple to see how some repairs are coming at the temple. And Hilkiah says to Shaphan, I have found a scroll of the Torah in the house of Yahweh, in the temple. They take this scroll, this book, and they read it to the king. The king, Josiah, when he hears this, he's like a teenager at this point, he hears the words of this book. And he says, great is the anger of Yahweh, which is burning against us, because our fathers did not listen to the words of this book to do all that is written about us. What book of words is this? Remember, the opening of the book of Deuteronomy is, these are the words that Moses spoke. And it's that word, Hebrew Devarim, is the name of the book of Deuteronomy in Hebrew. And he says now, we didn't listen to the words of this book. Now remember, you have to go back. Moses had said to the Levites, take this scroll of the Torah and put it up before the Lord, which would mean inside the tabernacle, somewhere near the ark, and it will be a witness there against you. Now it's Josiah, hundreds of years later in the 7th century, and they find a thing called the scroll of the Torah. It hasn't been mentioned since Moses and once in the book of Joshua. And there it is, and they go, oh my God, and you read it, you remember all those laws in Deuteronomy 12 to 26, all these things you're supposed to be doing, and nobody's been doing them. And then you remember Deuteronomy 28, this curse list of all these things that are going to happen to you if you don't do these things, and nobody's been doing them. And so he tears his clothes, which is a sign of mourning in the Bible. He's terrified, apparently, by this. At least that's how the story is told. And so they go to a prophetess. Her name is Huldah. It's nice we finally got a woman in here. And she gives a prediction that a terrible disaster is coming, but she says Josiah will go to his grave in peace. We'll see how much of that comes true and how much of it does not. But he initiates this tremendous reform. It was King Josiah. The year is 622 BCE. So this is too convenient for us. So I can make you learn those dates, right? 922, the kingdoms split. 722, Israel gets destroyed. 622, Josiah does this big religious reform. He does a big ceremony where they renew the covenant. He destroys all worship of the Baal and the Asherah and other gods. He removes the Asherah, whatever it is, from the temple. He goes to all these high places that had been rebuilt by his grandfather Manasseh, and he defiles all of them. He ends the practice of human sacrifice. And then he goes up to Bethel. You remember Bethel, that was where the northern kingdom of Israel had one of its two religious places, one at Dan and one at Bethel. And that's where there had been a golden calf, which apparently is gone. Somebody stole that and melted it down by now. But there's still that high place there. And he destroys the altar there at Bethel. And he burns human bones on the altar, which defile it so it can never be used again. And this fulfilled a prophecy that you had, if you look back in 1 Kings 12, on the day that King Jeroboam I established that altar as the religious place of Israel. This guy said, "Altar, altar, here a child will be born of the house of David, Josiah by name, and he will burn human bones on you." And now it all happens. He reinstitutes the holiday of Passover, and they have this tremendous religious celebration of Passover. Politically speaking, that means he rebelled against Assyria. Politically, it would appear that he is reconquering the north. If he's messing with Bethel, that's part of the former Israel. That's not part of Judah. So he's moving north. In short, he's like a new David. He's trying to reestablish old Israel. And so when he dies, the text says, "And there was no king like him before him or after him, who arose, who returned to Yahweh with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might, according to all the Torah of Moses, and there did not arise one like him after him." So even though it had already said about Hezekiah there was no king like him before him or after him, it now says that about Josiah too, which I admit is a little tricky and conflicting. It's slightly different wording, though, on Josiah. And it said that he did the whole thing. He followed God with all his heart and soul and might. Remember, in Hezekiah's time, they don't have the book with all these laws, but Josiah does. So when you're asked on an exam someday, who's the best king, according to the Bible, it is King Josiah. He's better than David. He's better than Hezekiah. He's better than all of them. The only problem is he then went to battle against the Assyrians, and he got it was a battle between Assyrians and Egyptians, and he got an Egyptian arrow in his heart, and he died. He was 40.